All right, good morning. Whoops, that's from last week. I'll get rid of that. There we go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome officially to Monday. Everybody seems in reasonably good spirits for Monday, but just you wait until week 10. You'll all be dragging in here. Oh, God. No, I'm just kidding. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. Nice to see you all here today. Again, hope everyone had a good weekend. I'm going to say hello to some people here. I'm going to say hello to Kayla, although I've seen her already this morning, but good morning again, Kayla. And Ariane, I'll say good morning to you. Hello. Before we get going and before I forget, I'd like to do a quiz. I'd like to do a quiz later this week. We did one in social justice, and Aria's here. Good morning, Aria. We did a quiz in social justice this morning, and I kind of want to make sure that we get a quiz in because we need to get 5 quizzes into this course, and sometimes it's a bit of a challenge, so we need to do our first one, okay? So, is Thursday too early? Yeah, no, let's try and do it Thursday, okay? So we'll do a quiz on Thursday for it, and there'll be 2 ways, okay? So for people who are online, what we'll do is I will, between 10 and 11 on Thursday, I'll call you in Microsoft Teams, okay? So we'll have an order, I'll call you, I'll ask you a few questions, we'll have kind of a little conversation type thing, and then that's how that quiz will work. It'll kind of be an oral quiz. For people who are in class here, you'll write your quiz from 11 to 11:45, and it'll just be, a regular paper quiz. I'll ask you 4 or 5 short questions, and you'll write the answers for them, okay? So it'll be a little different whether you're an online student or an in-person student, and I'll kind of deal with you separately. So the good news is that for both of you, for online students, you'll get to do your quiz and then you'll be done for the day. And in-person students, you get an extra hour. We'll start an extra hour later for you, okay? So that's kind of how it will work. I'll make the quiz. Thanks, Arian. I'm just gonna answer that. Everything I'm telling you, I'll put into Microsoft Teams so that you can read it again. I think I'll go with classes 1 through 8. I think that's what we'll do. So there'll be 8 classes worth of material on the quiz, okay? And again, all the lecture slides are posted on Student Portal under course documents, so you can review those. But that's kind of what it will be like, okay? So again, I'll deal with the online students first, and we'll have a little video chat in Teams, and then we'll move on to in-person students, and you guys will write just a regular paper quiz like you would in any other class. Sound okay? All right, so I do want to do that this week because I don't want to get, we probably should have done it earlier, but I didn't want it to conflict with our other assignment, and so I pushed it back a bit. Yeah, so you'll have to make sure, Arian, you'll have to make sure that you're caught up, okay? So again, all of those lecture slides are on Student Portal, so you can go back to them and catch up, okay? Let me see. Okay, so I'll put those details into Microsoft Teams later today so that you can read it. Again, if you have questions, you can ask me, but that's what we'll do on Thursday, okay? Now, let me see. So on Friday, what we were doing is we were kind of leading into this agricultural revolution, right? We said that people who hunt and gather are really kind of not found in most of the world today, right? Most of the world they either are farmers or, like us, they get their food from farmers, right? There aren't really many hunter-gatherers left. And I explained to you that around 12,000 years ago, some people in some parts of the world start growing their own food, right? And I had some graphics there showing you some places in the Middle East and in Egypt, in Central Africa, in the Mediterranean, in Southeast Asia, and a couple places in North and South America. So people start growing their own food, right? Which I suggested was a massive, massive change for humankind, right? Probably the biggest change we've ever been through as a species, has been that agricultural revolution, right? Before I go on, maybe I'll just point out one thing, is that keep in mind that not everybody switches to agriculture, right? Some people start around 12,000. It kind of spreads. Today, most people, either are farmers or get their food from farming, but some people really never switch, right? So if you think about indigenous people in Canada, for instance, until the arrival of white people like me, they never switch, right? They really never grow their own food. They really never turn to farming, right? Until colonizers show up. So again, some people switch to farming early, right? Around 12,000 years ago. Some people will switch later at some point, at some later date, but some people will never switch, right? Until colonization, really. So the agricultural revolution is something that happens, but it's something that happens, but it happens to, sorry, I just got distracted by an email that came in. But it happens only to some people. Good morning, come on in, come on in. Now, to explain why this happened, of course, we read this article on the worst mistake in the history of the human race, and I asked you to figure out the arguments in the paper, right? And so to kind of encourage you along this path, remember that I said that in this article there are two arguments, right? And so I said that Jared Diamond, the guy who wrote the article, he said, there's this other argument, these progressivists, they think this thing, but I think that's bunk, right? I think that's fake news. This is what I really think happened, and this is what I think, right? So there's two arguments in this paper. And I think we also said that the conclusions of those arguments were that the progressivists felt that, of course, switching to agriculture was a great idea, right? Progress, moving forward, this is great. While Jared Diamond thought, actually, no, this was not really that beneficial for people who switched, right? And his title kind of, I think, says it all in this case. He thinks it was a huge mistake for human beings, right? So I asked you for those arguments. I asked you to tell me what kind of evidence Jared Diamond used to support his idea that early farmers were kind of negatively affected by this agricultural revolution. And then the question of why, right? So if we're going to accept Jared Diamond's conclusion that in fact farming was a huge mistake, why did people do it, right? Why did people do something that was so obviously a huge mistake, right? That was kind of the assignment. And so it was in Microsoft Teams for you to finish. Some people are finished already. Some people are almost finished. Kwan, did you manage to find it in Teams or not yet? Not yet? Okay. What I would like to do is I want to just give you maybe 12 more minutes to work on it, okay? And if you're done, great. You can work on something else. If you're not, I'll give you about 12 minutes. You can work on it. I can answer questions or whatever you need. And then I'll, we'll move on. I'll try to mark it tonight if I can, and then we can review it tomorrow. Okay, so that's the plan. So that said, let me put 12 minutes on the clock here. You can go to work, and then at the end of that 12 minutes, we'll move on. Okay. And again, if you're already done, you can work on something else. If you're not, you can work on it, and you can certainly ask me questions. Okay. What's going on here?
We have that quiz on Thursday.
What's that?
We have quiz for Thursday.
On Thursday.
So it's class 1 to class 8, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
One question is going to happen. You need to give up an example for the like how to how category develop.
Anything that anything that we talked about or anything that I asked you is fair game. Okay.
What is human? What is human?
I did ask you that. Yeah.
The first class. The first class.
Yeah. Good morning. Well, I did ask you that,
Yeah.
right? So I could ask you again. Yeah. Anything we did in class 1 to 8 is fair game. Mike, we're just taking 10 more minutes just to work on our assignment from Friday, and then.
I just submitted.
Okay. If you submitted it, you can work on something else,
Okay.
and then after 10 minutes, we'll continue on. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to answer some questions for online people. So, yeah, so for Aria and Arian, the PDFs of the lecture slides are in Student Portal, so in your Columbia College Student Portal, and they're under Course Documents in Comparative Cultures. You'll find them there. Harry, we're doing an assignment that was assigned on Friday, and so you'll find that in Microsoft Teams under assignments. So if you look for assignments, you'll find this. Okay. Whoops. Let's see. Yes. So assignment in Microsoft Teams, lecture slides in Student Portal under Course Documents. Okay. Okay, so Fornar, did you find it? Are you okay?
Now I'm still looking on the.
Oh, you're just looking at that? Okay. If you click on assignments, one more down, I think. Okay, there you go. Here it is. So, yeah, so click on that, and then that Word document right there. Yeah. If you click on that, that's what you'll just put your answers into that, and then I'll be able to read it.
Also, all you do is answer.
Exactly.
Or I have just made my.
That works too. Either one.
Oh.
Yeah, you can either use that or you can attach your one already.
Oh.
Francois, how's it? Okay. Any questions? That's it. Hanging up there? Yeah. Was that a really good question?
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
I just speak English.
How do you submit? Okay, so if you close that up there. There, okay. And then, yeah, just hit turn in. Sorry, I thought it said submit. Turn in. And then you just, ta-da! Oh, you get a little, oh, nice. See, these are the things that I can't see if my computer. There you go. Okay. Maybe just let me know. Maybe you can put in brackets what the conclusion is and what's a premise, so I know what's what. So the conclusion of that argument we said was. Well, I think we said that it was that the switch to farming is a good idea.
Yeah.
Right? And so, again, good critical thinkers ask, well, why is it a good idea? Well, because it was efficient, all that stuff. Yeah. So just let me know what the conclusion is and what the premises are. Just so I know. Just so I know that you know what the difference is. Yes. we need to explain a little bit more about this population thing.
The population base.
That's kind of the crux of the matter. Yeah. Okay, people. So 12 minutes is up. So let's switch. Morning, Steve. Let's switch gears and get back into our story here. Okay. Now, again, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because I want to review this article and Jared Diamond's ideas, but of course I want to mark your stuff first. I want to see what you said and see how well we did in terms of pulling those arguments and ideas out of this article, right? That'll give me some clues as to what kind of assignments we can do after, okay? So, is this where I want to jump to? Yeah. So, the way I want you to kind of think about this, and again, we'll go into a little more detail, is that, again, around 12,000 years ago, for the kind of reasons that Jared Diamond states, people probably started to switch to agriculture. And again, it happens in certain parts of the world earlier, and then certain parts of the world later, right? Not everyone switches to agriculture, okay? But what's going to happen is that as more and more people do, right, as farmers start to take over land and sort of burn down all the trees and start to plant their crops and then build villages and towns and things, it gets much more difficult for people who are foragers, right? Because people who are foragers are out in the wilderness, right? And they're hunting animals, wild animals, and sort of harvesting wild plants. But the more that the environment gets changed, right? The more that these people start building farms and towns and villages, it starts impacting the natural environment, right? So hunter-gatherers, foragers, they have to move farther away to continue to practice their traditional lifestyle, right? And as more and more people start to create farms, the wilderness kind of gets farther away, and you either have to, keep moving far away from civilization, or eventually you kind of give up, right? And you say, okay, well, I guess we're going to join this farming community, right? So farming is something that kind of starts to expand. It starts to change the landscape, and people can't really make a go of it as foragers anymore, right? They have to change their subsistence strategy. Even if they weren't, the first people to do it, eventually they kind of get sucked into the system, right? As people start to change the natural environment, right? So the first farmers here again show up about 12,000 years ago, and probably the way that they start farming is they start doing something called swidden agriculture, okay? And swidden agriculture is very simple, and it's kind of the least work you can do and be a farmer, okay? Because as you may intuitively know already, most humans don't like to work any harder than they have to, right? We kind of like to do, as much work as we have to, but after that, we're done, right? And early farmers are really no different, right? They like to do as little farming as they can, or as little hard work as they can, to get as much food as they can. And so this kind of swidden agriculture, often what these early farmers are doing is burning down sections of land, okay? And so what you do is you find a patch of, forest or bush or something like that, and you burn it all down, okay? All the grass, all the trees, everything. You burn it all to the ground until it is nothing but ash, flat ash. Then you can kind of turn over the soil and plant your crops. And so because of all that burnt material, it acts as a fertilizer, right? It's good for the soil. And so you get a really good yield from this land, right? You just plant your seeds and everything grows really well, right? Of course, there's work associated with it. You've got to plant your seeds, right? You've probably got to build some sort of fence around your crops, right? You don't want animals coming in and, eating all your food, right? So you've got to do that. You've got to water the crops, right? You've got to pull out the weeds, because we all know weeds grow in everything. So there's work to be done. But when you sort of burn down sections of land like this, you get a big harvest, right? You get really fertile soil. So you'll see scenes like this in the past, people practicing swidden agriculture. This guy doesn't seem to be having that good a time, but I'm sure it's difficult work. Here we can see some people practicing some very simple agriculture, using very simple hand tools, right, to sort of dig and to plow. Here's some other people working away, doing some very simple agriculture. Now, this is a very productive way to farm. And so these kind of early farming villages start up around this kind of idea. People burning down sections of land. Everybody grows their own food, right? So basically, in a society like this, everyone is a farmer, right? Everyone is growing their own food in their backyard, sort of thing. And when your population level is pretty low, this works out quite well, okay? The problem is when your population level starts to grow, okay? So the trick is to this swidden agriculture, what you have to do is you burn down a section of land, you plant your crops, you get a really good yield, but after a few years of farming that same piece of land, your yield, your harvest is going to start to decline, right? Because you're depleting all of the nutrients in the soil. And so what are you going to do? Well, eventually you're going to have to switch and burn down another section of land, right? And move your field and then start growing there. And so you can do that, right? You can farm there for a few years, and then maybe the soil is kind of getting exhausted and your harvest is declining. So you burn down another section and you create a field there. And this works really well, but the problem is that that first field that you burn down has to sit for about 20 years or so to regrow, right? You have to let it kind of regenerate, and then you can burn it down again and plant your crops. But you could imagine, if you have a small population and a lot of land, great. You can just keep burning stuff down and it's no big deal. But as your population starts to grow, suddenly you're going to start to run out of land, right? You can't burn down that section of land because that belongs to someone else and they're still farming on it, right? And the person next door to you, you can't go there anymore either, right? So as populations rise, this kind of doesn't work very well anymore. It works very well for small populations, not big ones. And when your population gets past a certain point, you're going to be bumping up against the carrying capacity of the land, okay? And that probably came up in the article by Jared Diamond. But what we're talking about is this, right? Is that every kind of piece of land has a certain amount of food that it can produce at a certain subsistence level, right? So if we're going to hunt and gather, nature is only going to provide so much food, right? Now we can get more food if we plant our own, right? If we start planting our own, if we start weeding our gardens, if we start watering things, we can get nature to give us a little bit more, right? We put a little energy in, we get more out. Does that make sense so far? Yeah. And the thing is that the same thing happens here with this kind of simple Swidden agriculture. You can really only produce so much food with it. And if your population is low enough, you're good, right? You're producing enough food. But when your population goes too high, then you suddenly don't have enough land to produce food for your people, right? You're going to hit the carrying capacity of the land again. And so you have to make another change, right? You have to find another way to get more food out of the land. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so what do people do? Well, oh yeah, that's my Swidden agriculture people. Yeah, what do they do? Well, now you have to switch to something called intensive agriculture, okay? And this is where people are farming the same piece of land over and over and over again. The same field gets planted every single year. And to do that, you have to have some more complicated technology, right? You need to be able to fertilize the soil, right? You can't just keep growing crops on the same soil forever and ever, right? You'll suck all the nutrients out of it and eventually nothing will grow there. So you've got to know how to fertilize the soil. You need to know how to add pesticides. You need plows. You need irrigation. You need bigger fields. All of this comes along with intensive agriculture, okay? So the first style was kind of simple agriculture or Swidden agriculture. This is our third subsistence strategy here, intensive agriculture, okay? And so, again, with intensive agriculture, we've got big fields, we've got people using plows, we've got people using fertilizers. Sometimes they're using animals like oxen to help them plow the fields. They've got big storage facilities. They have irrigation canals and things like that. It's a much more complicated farming operation. But again, you need this if your population keeps going up, right? And that is one of the things that we kind of know about human population, is that it just seems to keep going up and up and up, right? And so here people have to make a change. And again, they start to do it in certain parts of the world. Usually the parts of the world that switch to agriculture first to begin with, right? So here's a great example of some intensive agriculture happening. This is from the wall of a tomb in ancient Egypt. I don't know how old it is. It's probably a good 4,000 or 5,000 years old, maybe a little bit more than that. And this guy is practicing intensive agriculture, right? He's got some oxen there. What's that little thing hanging behind the oxen? That little orange thing. Nobody? Nobody? Well, that is a plow, right? So that you use that to kind of furrow out the earth so that you can plant your seeds, right? So he's got his 2 oxen there. He's got his plow, which is new technology. He's got his whips there to kind of keep the oxen moving forward, right? So yeah, this is an excellent example of intensive agriculture in action, right? And again, if you go to that part of Egypt, if you go to the Nile Delta, you can still see some people doing this very thing, right? You can see a guy with his field there. He's planting his crops, and he's got his 2 oxen and a plow behind it, right? And he's going to use those oxen to help him plant his crops. Right? But it gets more complicated than this, even. Here's some kind of artist renditions of intensive agriculture, but you can see people starting to get into more complicated technology, right? You can see there's a big river there in the background, but people have dug canals, right? There are these canals that can be used to water the crops. And in some of the places where they first start using intensive agriculture, watering your crops is really really important. It is a hot and dry place, right? Mesopotamia is right now where kind of Iraq and Syria are. Those are hot, dry places, right? Egypt, hot, dry place, right? And so you need to find a way to water your crops, and this is how people start to do it. They start to dig irrigation canals and ditches. There's another, yeah, so they start to do that. You can see other types of intensive agriculture as well. You see a lot of these kind of terraced things in Southeast Asia. Again, that's a technological adaptation to make better use of the land, right? It's hard to farm on an incline, right? Because everything seems to just go downhill. So what do people do? Well, they create flat surfaces, right? Where there aren't any flat surfaces. And so they're actually maximizing the amount of land that they can farm. And so, as I say, throughout Southeast Asia, you see all kinds of these really cool terraced hillsides where people are growing crops, right? And it's a brilliant way to try to get more land to farm when you don't have it, right? Yeah, so intensive agriculture is important to look at for kind of 2 reasons here. Number one is that it allows humans to raise the carrying capacity of the land, right? So the land has a certain amount of food to give us, and if we want more, we have to do something, right? We have to put some energy in, we have to plant our own food, right? If we want even more than that, we have to do more work, right? We have to plow, we have to sow our seeds, we have to fertilize the land, we have to irrigate it, all kinds of things. We have to put in more work, but we're able to raise the carrying capacity of the land. The second thing that happens, though, is that this way of farming is actually it can be very productive, okay? And it can lead to the growth of complex civilizations, okay? And that's going to be our jumping off point to look at some cultures in this class, because intensive agriculture is what's going to allow those cultures to become, again, very large, very complex. It's going to lead them to start writing things down. And again, that's going to be our window in, right? Because when people don't write anything down, it's really tough to know what's going on in the past. But when they do, then we start to know all kinds of things, right? And so that'll be our jumping off point. But before I explain that to you, let's take a little break, and then when we come back, I'll talk you through the process of how that goes, okay? So take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about civilization, okay? Okay, and we're back. So this is kind of our third subsistence strategy that we're looking at. And again, it's an important one because again, it does allow for more population growth, but it's also going to create conditions for civilizations to develop. Okay, and so I'll show you how this kind of works. And I apologize for my crude graphic here, but I'll walk you through how it works. Okay. One of the things that's important about intensive agriculture is that it can, if done correctly, it can actually generate more food than people can eat. Okay, and that's a big step up because remember, with Swidden agriculture or with sort of simple farming, sometimes it's called horticulture too, depends on who you ask. With simple farming, everybody in your village is a farmer, right? Because everyone's just growing food for themselves. And so some people can do some other things, but pretty much everyone is focused on growing food for themselves and their family, right? That's an important thing. But switching to intensive agriculture with fertilizers and plows and irrigation canals and things like that, that can produce more food than people can eat, right? So then you've got kind of an interesting thing, right? So let's say we all lived in a village that was practicing Swidden agriculture or just simple farming. We're all farmers, right? That's what we do. We farm, we look after our crops so that we can feed our families. But if we're a group of people who live and practice intensive agriculture, well, my farm, right? If I'm a farmer, my farm can feed 4 or 5 families, right? And so what does that mean? Well, that means that Mike's family, Mike doesn't have to be a farmer anymore, right? Kwan doesn't have to be a farmer anymore. Tafadzwa doesn't have to be a farmer anymore, right? Neither does Chen. He doesn't have to be a farmer either, right? Because the food from my farm can feed them and all of their families, right? So what are these other guys to do now that they don't have to farm? Well, they can start to specialize in other things, right? They can start to do things that don't involve farming, right? Maybe Chen decides he's going to start raising chickens, right? Because people like chickens, they like to eat them, they like their eggs, but they need to get their chickens from somewhere. So Chen is going to raise chickens, right? Tafadzwa is going to decide maybe, you know what, people are growing grain, but they need a place to store their grain. And maybe these big clay pots are the ideal thing. And so Tafadzwa is going to specialize in these big clay pots that he makes so people can store their grain, right? Mike knows that people are out there plowing their fields all day, and sometimes their plows break, right? So Mike's going to specialize in building and repairing plows, right? And Kwan knows, of course, that in order to move those plows and plow the fields, people need oxen, right? They need ox to push the plow or to pull the plows. And so Kwan is going to breed ox and sell them to people, right? And there's all kinds of other people who can do this, right? Some people are going to make jewelry and clothing, right? Some people are going to grow fruits and vegetables and trade them for other agricultural produce, right? Some people are going to make like textiles, like blankets or maybe furniture for your house, right? And things like that. And so because not everyone has to be a farmer, because they have a food surplus, you get craft specialization, right? People don't have to farm, so they're free to kind of do other things, right? Whether it's raising animals, whether it's building things that other people need, and then they start trading, right? Tafadzwa is going to trade his clay pots for agricultural produce, right? So that he can eat. Same thing with Chen's chickens. Actually, that's kind of a good name. Same thing with, I can see a big sign in your market stall from thousands of years ago, Chen's chickens. Everybody is going to be able to do this. And then you get kind of a little economy going, right? A little trading economy where people start to trade for the things they need, right? Chickens or ox or plows or clay pots or jewelry or clothing or furniture, right? Or, you know, fancy things for around the house, right? People start to trade for these. So instead of everyone being a farmer, now people have different jobs, right? And you have these little kind of exchange economies starting to happen. So that's one thing that happens. But there's another kind of parallel development that comes from this food surplus, okay? And it has to do with that irrigation. So remember I showed you, yeah, good. I showed you this little graphic, right? And it's not the best graphic that I could find, but you can see that there are these irrigation canals that are dug through the farmland and they connect to the river. And you can't really tell from this picture because it's kind of cartoony, right? It looks like it's out of a kid's book. But the building of these canals is actually quite a feat, right? Because the canals are quite large, they're quite long, and they have to be engineered in a certain way so that the water will flow into them and stay in them, okay? So you need some knowledge to be able to design and survey and build these canals, right? Imagine building a canal, you get everyone together, you spend, you know, a couple months digging the canal and lining it, and then the river floods, but you got the angle wrong so the water doesn't go into the canal. Oof. People are going to be looking at you with some serious side eye, right? You have to know how to build these things, right? And so what starts to happen is because you not only need people to design the canals, but to sort of coordinate building them. You can't build one by yourself, right? Everyone has to cooperate. But then once they're built, they have to be maintained, right? Every year they're going to get full of mud and sticks and all kinds of garbage. And at the end of the season, you're going to have to go in and clean out the canals so the water can continue to come in, right? So these are kind of a large community-based project. And there's something that I can't do alone, and Fadzwa can't do alone, and Felicia can't do alone. We kind of all have to cooperate. And so to do it, we need someone who's in charge, right? Somebody who's in charge of the canals, right? In charge of surveying them and designing them and building them, and then kind of coordinating and making sure that we all contribute to maintaining them and cleaning them out, because all of our crops depend on it, right? If Felicia lets her section of the canal get all clogged with junk and she doesn't clean it out, then Kang's crops aren't going to get watered, right? Because Kang's crops are further down the canal, right? And Kang's going to be standing in front of his dry crops looking at Felicia going, hey, clean out your canal, right? So we all have to cooperate here, right? And so you need some kind of an administration, right? You need somebody who's in charge of this sort of thing. And again, because these people aren't going to be farmers either, right? How are we going to pay them? How are we going to pay them to do this, to design and build and maintain the canals? Well, we're going to give them part of our harvest, right? We're going to give them some of the crops so that they can do all of this work. And that's kind of like the very earliest form of taxes. I'm sorry, even thousands of years ago, taxes still exist. You know, we used to be hunter-gatherers, just kind of living a simple existence. It was all good. And then the next thing you know, there's taxes, right? Where did we go wrong? But anyway, this is, you know, we're paying these people to form an administration, right? And then, you know, what if there's a problem, right? What if Felicia still won't clean out her section of the canal and Kang's crops are still drying out, right? What are we going to do? Well, I assume Kang could go in there and clean out the canal himself, or he could go over and, like, you know, start hitting Felicia over the head with a club or something. But really what we need is some form of kind of justice, right? We need somebody who's in charge and can say, look, Felicia, you need to clean out your canal, or there'll be a punishment for it, right? And so we almost have the beginnings of like a little justice system, right? The administration is in charge of the canals, but they're also starting to, do a little bit of justice as well, right? Then, what if Nancy's not paying her taxes, right? What if we're all growing our crops, we're all contributing to this and, the canals, but then Nancy's not giving her harvest to the administration? How do they know? They have to keep track, right? They need to create written records, right? So that they know that Kenny paid his taxes and I paid my taxes. But they also know that Nancy didn't, right? And so this is where writing comes from. And I'm sorry to admit this too, it's kind of a downer, but the very first writing is created for accounting. Right? It's created to make sure that we know who paid their taxes and how much they owe next year, right? And so here this administration starts taking on a little more, right? They're doing tax collection, they're keeping records, they're resolving disputes, right? And over time, this administration is going to start to evolve into something that looks like a state, right? A state where we have somebody in charge, a ruler, a king, someone like that, right? A state with bureaucrats, right? People who do the work of government, people who write things down and keep records and organize things and collect taxes and so on and so forth. And then we're also going to need maybe even an army eventually, right? And the army is going to come much later. Thousands of years ago, the army was us, right? So if we live in an intensive agriculture civilization and somebody's attacking us, we're the army, right? Go get your sword. Real armies will come a little bit later, but still, these are kind of the very beginnings of a state, okay? And so again, it all rests on the ability of people to grow more food than they can eat, right? When you can't do that, everyone's a farmer, right? And none of this stuff really happens. But when you have more food than you can eat, suddenly it frees people up to do other things, right? To specialize in different crafts, to become bureaucrats, to become priests, to become, in some cases, professional soldiers. All of these things are made possible because not everyone needs to farm anymore, right? We can produce more than enough food with just some people farming. Make sense? Yeah, and it kind of happens, it's interesting, it kind of happens this way in every civilization. And that kind of brings us to the idea of what a civilization is. When I say civilization, what kind of comes to mind for you? What do you think about? A what? The change of humanity? Okay. What kind of change? Okay, how they think about stuff? What else comes to mind when I say civilization? What comes to mind here? What comes to mind when I say something is civilized or not civilized?
Something is civilized. So that's mean they have their style, like living style, level like own lifestyle system, they have like skills or technology.
Okay, so the idea of civilized has something to do with being skilled or technologically advanced, maybe a way of thinking, right? That's all good, yeah. Aryan says that changes of the culture for sure, right? So civilized, I'm going to put that in quotes, civilized cultures are different than uncivilized cultures in some ways. What else does it lead you to think about? There's a video game called Civilization 2, right? So you could probably think of that. What's that? The environment? What about the environment? How does it change?
Like when, for example, for hunter-gatherers, if they like live, um, when they move out every month,
Yeah.
and then they start to build a town underneath their land, start to build their own farms.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Civilizations tend to create their own environment, right? Hunter gatherers are kind of living within nature. They modify their environment too, but not to a great degree usually. But civilizations do tend to build their own environment, right? They build towns and roads and buildings and irrigation canals and all kinds of things, right? They pretty heavily modify the landscape for their own use. What else? What else? Okay. So Ariane says it's a change in lifestyle, and yeah, for these early civilized cultures, I think it definitely was. Ariane's making an example here of, moving from like physical street games to video games, and clearly here we're thousands of years before video games, but it would be a change in technology, right? So civilizations tend to have technology that non-civilizations don't, right? And so maybe that's a good place to switch and show you this, right? So civilization is kind of a strange word. Comes from the Latin civilis, which has to do with a citizen. And so it might be interesting to kind of remember that citizens are people that bring themselves together to cooperate, right? In political ways, in social ways, in economic ways. That's kind of what a citizen is, right? They're a person who belongs to a certain area, and they're part of this cooperative system, right, that people have. And again, we said that that was one of the important things of what humans are, right? They are creatures that live together and cooperate, right? And civilization is one way in which humans can do that, right? And they can do it in large numbers. Yeah, like I think sometimes we have this kind of idea that things that are civilized are somehow better, right? And here we're kind of not trying to say that necessarily. We're not trying to say that civilizations are better or worse. But they do tend to be more complicated, right? They have more complicated technology. They have more complicated social structures, more complicated political structures. Everything is more complicated. And so we're not saying that civilization is better or worse than anything else, but it is more complex, right? And often we know more about civilizations because they start writing things down, right? That tells us a lot about what these groups of people are thinking and feeling and doing, right? When there's no written records, it's hard to know, right? You wind up making a lot of guesses, unfortunately. Yeah, so I'm just going to skip to here. Yeah, so really what we're talking about when we talk about civilizations is groups of people that are working together in very complex ways, okay? And so again, it doesn't say anything about the intelligence of people, doesn't say whose culture is better than whose, because we don't want to get into that either. It just says that we have groups of people that are cooperating in a very complicated way. Okay, that's all we're saying. Yeah. So this is what we'll say that civilizations are kind of about. All right. Civilizations are, again, groups of people cooperating together, but they usually have specialization of labor. Okay, so we have people with different jobs, right? All kinds of different jobs. We have economic and political centralization. So somebody is in charge of these civilizations, whether it's a king or a priest king or whatever it happens to be, or a shah or whatever. somebody is in charge of this. There is a central authority, right? The domestication of both humans and animals, right? So usually we think about domestication, sort of taming animals, but really what it means in the sort of original Greek form is to live in a house, right? The Greek word for house is domos. And so something that is domesticated is something that lives in a house. And what do these people do? They live in a house, right? So crops have been domesticated, animals have been domesticated, but humans are domesticated as well. Civilizations have monumental architecture. So not just regular houses, but usually big stone buildings, right? Often they're temples, sometimes they're palaces of the ruler, but they build big things, right? Usually of stone. Civilizations have taxes, right? Because the ruler has to be able to accomplish things with money, and the money comes from taxes. Civilizations also often think of themselves as better than everyone else. So no matter where you are in the world, in the ancient world anyway, people in civilizations think they're much better than the people living off in the hills, right? They feel they're more, they're more cultured, they're more civilized, they're more technologically advanced. Those people who live in the hills, they're a bunch of barbarians, right? So civilizations feel that they are kind of superior. And civilizations like to expand themselves, right? So you often see that a civilization will appear, but then they'll want to take over more land, right? Often the ruler will want to wage wars against the surrounding area to bring it under their control, right? So these are kind of all characteristics of a civilization, right? A group of people cooperating together in a very complex way, and that complex way has to do with all of these different things. Okay. Now, that officially brings us to our first set of civilizations, I suppose. Has anyone ever seen or heard this word before in their lives? Yeah? No? What do you know about Mesopotamia, Kenny?
Their own civilization.
Mm-hmm.
They're good at war.
They're good at war. They definitely are. There's a lot of wars that are fought in this part of the world, for sure. Everybody's kind of looking at screens. There's about 4 people looking at screens. Are you looking at me on a screen, or are you looking at something else? Because I should warn you, my ego is very shallow, and when people don't pay attention to me, I feel very, hurt, and like it hurts my feelings, and I'm very fragile that way. So, yeah, like I need you to pay attention to me, otherwise, like I'll crumble and start crying in front of you, and nobody wants to see that. So, up here. Let's look at Mesopotamia here. So Mesopotamia is not so much a culture, but it's a region. It's a part of the world, okay? And as we'll see, there's a bunch of different cultures that kind of appear and sort of rise and fall in this part of the world. But it's a part of the world where one of the first civilizations develops. It's a part of the world where people first start farming. And so yeah, we're gonna look at it first. Mesopotamia is Greek for between the 2 rivers, right? So Meso, Potas? I forget what it is. Greek word, a land between two rivers. And so here are the rivers here. So you can see the Euphrates there and the Tigris. This is a part of the world that has a very long history. It's referred to in the Bible. People reference, if you've ever heard of the Garden of Eden, in the Bible, the Bible places it somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates, and so it's an area of the world with a very, very long history of civilization. Yeah, and brought about by intensive agriculture that people are practicing on the banks of these two rivers. Okay, and as you can see, it's kind of in the present day, sort of Iraq and Syria, although some of these names are quite old, right? So Syria is a name or a region that's quite old. Canaan is kind of an old term for that part of the world. That's Israel currently, right? Lebanon has been around for a while, but it's a specific country now. Yeah, so this is kind of the area of the world that we're looking at. And so, again, this isn't sort of a one unified culture, but there's a bunch of little city-states that appear, and again, there are different cultures that kind of rise and fall, right? And as we'll see here, the Sumerians will come first, and they'll be around for, as you can see, about 2,500 years. And then they'll be kind of, their city-states will be taken over by this different culture, these Akkadians. And then some Babylonians will show up, and Hittites will conquer the area later. And so it's an area of the world that is civilized, quote unquote, right? It's got cities and monumental architecture and complicated agriculture, but the culture that's in charge of that area will change over time. Okay, so again, Mesopotamia isn't really a culture, it's an area, but it's home to a number of cultures throughout this kind of ancient world period. Okay, let me see. Yeah, so Mesopotamia has been called the Cradle of Civilization, although the title is being challenged a little bit because I think we now have archaeological evidence from the Indus River Valley in Pakistan, which seems to be a little bit earlier than Mesopotamia. So originally Mesopotamia was thought to be kind of the first civilization, but the Indus River Valley civilization in Pakistan might be a little bit older. But we'll deal with that one in due course. Mesopotamia is important for two things. Number one, the first cities appear there. So most of us are, I think all of us, are from cities or live in cities, but cities are brand new for Mesopotamia. No cities exist before the ones that appear in Mesopotamia. And of course, the second is this is the first instance of writing. Humans don't write anything down ever until they start writing things down in Mesopotamia. Okay, so writing is actually invented here. It'll be invented in other places a little bit later on, but the Mesopotamians are probably the first ones to start doing this. And again, that's important because reading and writing is critical to all of our lives right now, right? So this is the first instance of it. I'm going to throw some abbreviations at you here because you'll see them for the rest of the course, and they're sort of important to know. They have to do with dates, not the kind you go on with a cute guy or girl, but the kind that you, that's a dumb joke. Sometimes you just got to go for it though, you know. They have to do with dates, and they put them sort of before and after the year zero, right? Actually, there is no year zero. So you've probably seen dates that have BC and AD after them, yes? Yeah. So BC is kind of before Christ, and so it's a little. These are a little weird because the Romans didn't really have a term or a symbol for zero, and so when you go from 100 BC and then you go to 50 BC and then you go to 1 BC and then you jump right to 1 AD. So there's no year zero. You go right from 1 to 1. They also kind of screwed it up because it seems that Jesus was actually born in about 4 AD. So it's kind of a weird system, but they kind of put the center point at when Jesus was born, more or less. And years before that are in BC, years after it are AD. So if I'm talking about something that happens in 2000 BC, how many years ago is that from now? Something happens in 2000 BC, how many years ago is that? 4021, right? Because we've got 2,000 years after and we've got 2,000 years before. So something that happened in 2000 BC actually happened 4,021 years ago, okay? So it's kind of a strange system, right? But it's the one that, you know, was created thousands of years ago, and we kind of have stuck with it because everybody now knows how it works. Well, maybe some of you are just hearing about it for the first time, but historians kind of became comfortable with it, and so they stuck with it. You'll often sometimes see BCE and CE. A little more recently, some historians said, why are we, you know, we're talking about before Christ and after death, Anno Domini, but like, what does that mean to people who are not Christian, right? If we're talking about, you know, rural peasants in China 20 or 2,000 years ago, they don't know who Jesus is, right? And they don't care. So some people said we should probably just say like before the Common Era and the Common Era. So the numbers of the years are the same, they're just calling it something different. Again, it doesn't mean BC is the same as BCE. It doesn't matter, same thing. And then sometimes you'll see BP, and that's before present. Okay, so sometimes you'll see this with radiocarbon dates, and again, that's what we're talking about when we say 4021. That's 4021 years BP, before present. But usually you see that with radiocarbon dating, and so they'll say like, you know, 20,000 BP, so before present, before now. So there's kind of different ways to sort of explain this time, but I just wanted you to know how this whole thing works. And again, the BC AD thing is a little weird and confusing sometimes, especially because before, when you're in years BC, the years are actually going the opposite way, right? Next year is going to be 2022, but if it was 2022 BC, next year would be 2021 BC, and then it would go to 2020 BC, which is weird. Plus, we don't want to go back to 2020, do we? No. I didn't think so. So, yeah, so in Mesopotamia here we have excavations that date back at least 10,000 years. So people are starting to stay in one place and starting to farm at least 10,000 years ago. Again, people would have hunted and gathered there before, but in this part of the world, people start to stop moving around, they start to farm, and they start to kind of exchange things, right? And so that process of creating a civilization started in Mesopotamia about 10,000 years ago. 10,000 BCE, sorry, so about 12,000 years ago. Pardon me. Right, so that brings us to a section of the text that I would like us to read. It's just a few pages, but it's going to give us a bit of background into Mesopotamia and kind of what's going on there, okay? I have some questions here for you. I'll put them on the screen, but I'll also put them into Microsoft Teams just so you can have them there as well, okay? So I'm going to let you start reading, although we won't have enough time, we won't have enough time to sort of take them up in class today, but we will be able to do that tomorrow, okay? So I'll let you start reading from the text. I'll put these questions in Microsoft Teams just so it's a little easier for you. And that's what we'll do. La, la, la. Okie dokie. Well.
All good? That is it. Go back. Yeah, it's a global speed tax. Hey. Oh, you're good, you're good. Kenny, are you good? Ken, are you good? Good. Hey, are you good? Nancy, you okay? Good shot. Okay. really hurt? Oh no, you're too young. Too young to have sore back.
Okay, good people. So that's about all the time we have. We'll pick this up tomorrow. We'll finish these questions. I'm going to try and have your stuff marked for tomorrow too, so that we can go over that, because I want to go over that before we get too far into Mesopotamia here. Also, I don't know if you're interested, but Canada's having an election today. So we'll see. Maybe, I don't know if by the end of the day, I don't know if we'll know what the government looks like. I suspect it's going to look basically the same as it did before the election, but we'll, we'll see what happens. But anyway, that's all for today, so I'll let you pack it up. Thank you for being here. I'll see you not first thing tomorrow. I'll see you at 10:05 tomorrow. Okay? Okay. All right. See you, people.